starting over now. Well, thank you for joining us today, talking about the Unessay and successes, challenges, and overall experience in incorporating an Unessay in our classes. I wanted to, let me figure out how to get the slides going. There we go. Okay. So I want to first start off by sharing a little bit about what an Unessay is. And actually, I should take a second to shout out to the Tea for Teaching podcast that Jessamyn and I recorded with John and Rebecca on the Unessay. We kind of dive into a lot of what I'm going to talk about here, but in that episode. So I should have put a link to that in here, but I wanted to first start off by sharing a little bit about what an Unessay is. It's basically anything except an essay. That's the short of it. But you know, traditionally in our courses, we might assign, at least particularly in criminal justice, it's a very common thing to assign a research project, some type of research paper in our upper division courses, and an Unessay kind of flips that traditional assignment on its head and really challenges students to think outside of the box, use their creativity, and communicate their research in any way they choose outside of a traditional research paper. And so I really got inspired to use the Unessay after Jessamyn did a presentation, I believe it was summer 2022 that she had done, or it was, I think, spring breakout, perhaps 2022, that she had done a discussion on the Unessay in her courses. And it was that point where I was like, oh yeah, I'm totally bought in. I want to do this in my senior seminar course, which is our capstone course for criminal justice majors. And it also reminded me of a class that I took in grad school on racism in the criminal justice system. And one of the grad students in my program in this course had done some research and presented on the use of Nutriloaf in prisons as a form of punishment for various violations that might occur within a prison setting. And so if you don't know what Nutriloaf is, I actually don't recommend looking it up because it is a very, very gross, at least I found the ingredients to be quite alarming in the recipes that I found. But essentially, it's a very bland type of food where all of the nutrients and calorie required, you know, all the minerals and vitamins that are required to be as part of a daily diet are all put into one loaf, I guess. And it's actually been the subject of a lot of controversy. There have been appeals in Supreme Court cases on whether it constitutes a cruel and unusual punishment. Anyways, what really struck me as this graduate student had been presenting on this topic was she actually created Nutriloaf for the class. She baked a loaf of bread that had all kinds of things in it that I won't go into because it will probably nauseate a lot of us watching this. But she actually created this and then brought it to the classroom, cut it up, gave everybody a slice to try. And it was a really I mean, you know, to this day, it has stuck with me, and I, you know, remember these discussions so vividly, and it really, it has carried with me, you know, that topic. And so I, you know, thought about how what she had done in some ways was very much like the Unessay that Jessamyn had been describing in this workshop that she had held. And so it really kind of led to this realization that students can achieve all of the same learning outcomes without a traditional research paper. They can still engage in research, they can still synthesize that research, they can communicate it orally and in writing, but they don't necessarily have to write a 20-page paper in our courses. They can really kind of use that creativity to explore other mediums to communicate that information. And it also very much aligned with my goals of inclusive teaching and learning. It allowed students to express their learning in different ways. It was challenging for some students to, depart from that traditional paper, but in the end, I think it created a very memorable experience for them, and I hope that it seemed to me as part of that anecdote of that they were very motivated to engage in this research because they had these different opportunities to express their learning. And so for creating the assignment, I'll actually go ahead and click on this document here that I created for my students. And I think you should be able to see that. Can you see that all right?
Yeah, it's small on the
It's
screen.
not loaded here yet.
Yeah. Is that can you see it all right?
I can see it. I can't really read it, but I can see it.
Yeah, I could, yeah, it probably is a little bit small.
You're right.
Zoom in on this. Well,
Oh, that's
I'll
better.
just give you
I can read it now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
maybe a
I
little-
turned the screen and it works a lot better.
Oh, gotcha. Awesome. So, first I created this assignment form, and I did this right at the very beginning of the semester. It was, followed my syllabus. So they had a very kind of in-depth look at what this project was going to be. It wasn't just a quick little blurb in the syllabus. It was, a laid out project so that they could see all of the elements that went into that are going into the Unessay. And hopefully, I think it created some good expectations for the students right off the get-go. So it explains a little bit about what an Unessay is. I gave some examples of some ideas that could be used as an Unessay. So maybe a performance, a video, artwork, reinventing board games, creating a cooking or a baking lesson, podcasts, D&D style role-playing games. There's really, no shortage of opportunities for students to express their research in. I also included the important dates here. And I spent a little bit of time talking about why I wanted to incorporate the Unessay. And I think, again, students have an expectation of how courses are supposed to look like, right? They know that going into a capstone senior seminar course that they are going to be responsible for some major project, typically. And, when they were confronted with the Unessay, not surprisingly, they were a little bit concerned. They were a little bit taken aback because it wasn't what they were expecting. And so I really, in order to get that buy-in, I was very clear with the students up front about why I was seeking this approach. I thought it was going to provide an equal learning opportunity for them that wasn't a traditional paper. And for some students, I had a few students who were really clinging and really wanted to complete a traditional paper. And ultimately they did a little bit of a combination of a more creative work plus some type of research paper. But ultimately, I think at the end, they really enjoyed having a lot of autonomy in this project, especially because some of the goals in that capstone course are to prepare them for their future careers and to have them brainstorm and think about the ways they can transfer the skills that they're gaining in the classroom into their chapter after Oswego. And so I think they really appreciated the ability to take this and use it for as an example for interviews and for kind of engaging in that next step in their careers. So I'll go back to this link is in the PowerPoint, and I can certainly send that to anybody who wants a copy of it. But ultimately, the learning objectives for this assignment were the same that I had for traditional papers that I had done in previous capstone courses. So it was to critically analyze empirical research related to criminal justice policies and practices, to conduct independent research, and of course, develop those written and oral communication skills. So the same learning objectives I had used for traditional papers just carried over into the Unessay project. So there were no changes that were made in order to adapt the Unessay, just simply a new way for them to express their learning. I scaffolded this assignment, and I did this as well when I used a traditional paper. I had students create a thesis statement and a annotated bibliography and a introduction, a conclusion, a draft, and so forth. But in the Unessay, it looked a little bit different. This whole project began with a proposal. And this proposal, and again, I followed a lot of the resources that Jessamyn Neuhaus had on her website, Geeky Pedagogy, to create, the process that I wanted for my students. And so we first started off with a proposal. That proposal was a relatively short paper because they were encouraged to begin some of their preliminary research on their topic, to include that in there. But they were also required to really get into the details of what would this project entail, what kind of timeline were they looking at in order to engage in this project, what was that presentation going to be like, how were they going to, what was the outcomes, the outputs of this project, and how did they believe this project was going to meet the 4 learning objectives that I had set out for this Unessay. And so the proposal was something that the students were able to revise, an unlimited amount of times throughout the semester. A lot of the time it was because I had given them written feedback, and some of the time it was oral feedback, or they had talked to their peers about their project, and they were able to then continually revise and allow this project to evolve, which, I think was quite of a refreshing experience for them. And so, actually, I'm going to go back to the scaffolding assignments then. So I did include an annotated bibliography because this was, I still wanted students to have some engagement, and of course, as the learning objectives required, there was still a lot of research that was embedded in this project. So they did have an annotated bibliography, which was very similar to what I had assigned in a traditional research paper, but this time they weren't going to be synthesizing that research into a 20-page paper. They were going to find new ways to communicate the patterns that emerged from the literature reviews that they had conducted. And so, and find a way to communicate that in an interesting way. After they met with me in a midterm meeting and submitted their annotated bibliographies, they were then charged with creating the outputs related to this Unessay. And then to present that to their classmates. So that actually took up, probably about a month of time for our in-class presentations, because some of the students had podcasts or videos or movies or stories that would, take up maybe a half an hour, 40 minutes of class time. And so students would, in their proposal, sort of gauge how long they were expecting to take in a particular presentation period. And then we would all set up the schedule to ensure that everyone had enough time to communicate their projects to their classmates. Following their presentations, they submitted a project statement, which helped them connect their project outcomes with the learning objectives for the course. And it also gave us some space to kind of talk about the research that they've conducted and how their projects exemplified that research or pushed that literature into a new direction. And throughout the or as part of that project statement, the students also created a self-assessment, and we then met at the end of the semester in a final meeting to talk about their goals of their project, whether they felt they had achieved all of the goals that they had set out to achieve, and to what extent did they achieve those learning objectives. So, you know, it was a bit of a time-consuming project to set up because I provided exemplars of every stage of this project. So that included example proposals, example annotated bibliographies, examples of the actual Unessay, and, you know, creating all of those self-assessments. I did all of that prior to the beginning of the semester so that I could work out any issues in the project, and I could try to foresee any problems that would come up and address them right off the bat, because I think with an essay and really any kind of long semester long project, it's important to you know, to have a sort of roadmap for students so that they, you know, aren't, you know, nearing the end of the semester and they're searching for resources to help them finish their project. So it was important to me to have all of that laid out right at the beginning so that they knew what they were getting into, and they were aware of what my expectations of them were. So some of the examples of the Unessay that my students created, we had a Monopoly game which featured criminal justice process outcomes for people of varying socioeconomic status. And so the students actually got up to play the game. Certain students were given lower socioeconomic statuses, so they started out with different amounts of money and different abilities to purchase property and to gain wealth in the game. And they also included, you know, community cards and various scenarios where they would be required to pay a bail amount in order for them to get out of jail, or you know, they would reap the consequences of plea bargaining, regardless of guilt or innocence, and how that would affect their future in the game. And so it was a really the students were really engaged in it. They were very motivated to try to beat the wealthier the wealthier competitors in the game, but it wasn't really set up for that, right? So our students who had game pieces that were associated with lower socioeconomic status had a lot harder time navigating the criminal justice system than our wealthier participants. So it was a really well thought out, well created game, and I actually had a picture of that as the beginning of our at the beginning of our presentation here. And so she actually used a Monopoly game and created new squares and new pieces. She actually had it emulate a lot of the things in her own neighborhood, in her own community back at home. And you know, and so it was cool for her to get pictures of those places, you know, from her community to then, you know, make this Monopoly board. So we had a podcast on campus sexual assault, and that actually featured interviews from people actually across the country, and even I think there were even some students in Canada who talked about campus sexual assault and programs that are happening on their campus. And it was a really, well done podcast. And students, you know, I didn't really even give them a lot of, guidance on how to create a podcast. They really took it upon themselves, and some people had experience with podcasts prior, so they were able to rely on their peers to kind of talk about different platforms to use. And you know, it was, I mean, really, there were a lot of wonderful projects that came out of this. We had a series of TikTok videos where students were interviewing people on campus about various perceptions related to criminal justice topics, and then they compared those perceptions from their interviewees to the actual research, and what does that research actually tell us about those varying topics. So that was pretty cool. I had to learn to use TikTok though in order to follow my students on their page, but they had a lot of fun doing it. It was actually a group of students. So this was an example of students working together as a group in an essay, which they enjoyed. They were able to kind of work on each other's strengths. Some students were a little camera shy, so they worked on the editing of their videos. It was a pretty fun project to follow. There was a play around political candidates, their views on criminality and subsequent policies. So a student wrote a screenplay, or I guess not a screenplay because it wasn't a video, but it was a play. Is that what you just call it? I guess. She was a playwright, I suppose, and created various parts and involved the audience as the classroom in it, because at one point they had to vote for their candidates and how you know, they felt like, you know, best represented the policies that they thought were going to be most effective at addressing crime and in their community. So it was pretty cool. There was a choose your own adventure on re-entry, which was pretty cool. So if you're aware of any kind of choose your own adventures, I always think of like the Goosebumps books back in elementary school for me, where you would follow your protagonist and they would come into a particular choice and you would get to choose where that protagonist ended up, and you'd have to flip to another part of the page or another part of the book to see what the fate was of the choices that that protagonist made. And so in this case, it was a choose your own adventure about a person experiencing barriers to being released from a carceral sentence and re-entering into the community. It was pretty cool. We had a lot of short stories as well on criminalization of abortion and gang involvement. And some students actually kind of drawing on some of their own personal experiences with this. So it was a really, the type and the topics that were chosen were so broad and varied, and it was, I think, a really cool experience for myself, because I, you know, wasn't getting a number of, you know, papers on the same topic. It was, you know, I think the breadth of topics was really astonishing in this essay. I talked a little bit about this in a session yesterday, but I used, because it was a non-traditional assignment, I decided to incorporate a non-traditional grading system. And so I used ungrading, which you'll have to forgive the autocorrects tended to change ungrading to upgrading. So forgive that on the presentation. But I thought I caught all of the areas where it did that, and I guess I did not. But part of ungrading is to really create this culture of feedback. So to not give letter grades at every stage of the Unessay, but rather give or have students and myself focused on the feedback that I can give them at that period of time, allow them to revise and continue to incorporate that feedback throughout the semester. And you know, and to really focus their work as a as a conversation and as something that is continually evolving, not something that they just submit and they are completely finished with and they can put it out of their mind and never think about it again. I really wanted them to, to keep working on this project as an evolving assignment throughout the semester. And so I expected to have a lot of challenges related to student buy-in, but really it was more my own buy-in that I think I came up to kind of some unexpected feelings about. In some ways, there's a lot of comfort in grading traditionally because it's what I know and it's what I've always done. It's what I've always been held to as a student and as a professor. And so really a lot of the culture of feedback and having to work against some of the some of my own wants of just assigning a grade and being done with it. I really needed to kind of force myself to be part of this conversation with my students and yeah, so that was kind of an unexpected I felt in this Unessay. The self-assessment and final meeting, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Grades were determined through a conversation at during finals week. We each had a final exam meeting, which was essentially like an oral exam where I asked students to fill out a self-assessment where they were asked to assign themselves a grade and to discuss their project overall and to really gather all of the evidence of why they felt their grade should be a particular grade. So, some of that evidence included all of the drafts and all of the final products that they had worked on. And so I think I had mentioned before, most students submitted their scaffolded assignments about 2 to 3 times. Some students upwards of 4, 5, 6 times. Extent of feedback that they were really working on incorporating and how many times it took for them to incorporate all of the feedback I was providing them. And so some of that evidence included all of those drafts, and some of it included if they were working together as a group, it would be a short journal of or schedule of all of the times that they met outside of class to talk about this. It was, I really wanted them to think about how they can advocate for themselves in a meeting with the supervisor. In this case, it was me as the professor. But it's something that they're going to be doing on a regular basis throughout their lives. And so this was it was a little intimidating to engage in these conversations, both for me as the professor. I was afraid there was going to be a lot of disagreement, a lot of very messy decisions, and I was really concerned that I'd have a lot of different expectations of what those grades might be from my students. But the reality was that most times, I can think of one student in particular, we were definitely on different pages of where their grade should be, but once we really talked about the evidence of the work they had completed and the extent to which they had incorporated the feedback throughout the semester, we really were able to come to an agreement, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. It ended up not being the kind of conflict that I, had been worried about and had anticipated. Some of the challenges, overall is that I use this untraditional grading practice in my Unessay, but I did use traditional grading practices in other parts of my course. And so I don't think it's actually a very uncommon thing to use multiple methods of assessment in a course, but it did take a little bit of, I did have to think a little bit about what the grade value was going to be for the Unessay. I couldn't just say it was going to be an A because I had to then average that with other elements in my course. And so, or I had to weight it in connection to other elements of my course. And so it did require a little bit of conversation with students about some of the numerical values associated with the letter grades that they were giving each other, because I didn't want them to then be confused about, well, why did they get a 93 instead of a 92, or a 94 instead of a 93, or an 81 instead of an 80. So there was a little bit of, muddiness, I guess, to it, but it's something that I'm excited to be doing again this semester in parts of my course, and hopefully working through some of those challenges. So ultimately, things went a lot better than I expected. One of the things that went really well is that I have students submit all of their original assignments and all of the revisions in their final work with me. Proposal link, if they revised it, the first revision, second revision, third revision, fourth revision, it would all go into that same link. So I could easily toggle back and forth between all of their submissions. It was really nice. So Brightspace, I think, really helped us of that organization in the course, which was great. Things I wish I did. I wish I had spent more time emphasizing peer feedback in earlier stages of the Unessay, because there were a lot of concerns as the presentations went underway, that some students felt that they didn't have as good of projects as other students. So they started to kind of play this comparison game with each other. And I think we could have squashed some insecurities and anxiety related to their projects if we had started some of those, if I had put more time and emphasis on those peer conversations early on to kind of help each other develop their projects in a way. I think they would have I absolutely should have done a lot more self-assessments at each scaffolded stage and at each revision. I should have had it be kind of part of their revision process, so that they could then, go through, just like we have like a rubric, they could go through, do that self-assessment every time and see that improvement as they move forward. That way they're not, when they got more revisions or, further comments on the paper, they wouldn't necessarily be, confused as to why they're getting more revisions, and that they also just get in the practice of ensuring that they're incorporating all of the feedback in any given revision, because I think I have historically given feedback to students in research papers, and they'll go through and they'll fix all the commas and all the capitalization. They'll go fix all the easy things, but to go restructure their arguments, to go, restructure the synthesis of their research, those are harder things for students to tackle. And it was nice, I think, the way I had this kind of unlimited feedback loop with students, that I could go back and say, we still have to work on this piece, or you've got half of this down, but let's work on this other part of it. So that's, I think having more self-assessments would have assisted with that as well. I think, I did ask students to think about in their proposals what an A grade might look like for their projects. And like, what would they describe that a quality grade to look like for their projects, but I probably should have had them identify other grades as well. I think that would have had a little more, I think it would have structured some of the conversations we had a little bit better. And I think I should have also had them submit some kind of project deliverable before they did their presentation. Because we got to a couple of presentations, certainly not all of them, but there were a few students who really, I think, needed feedback about their presentations and their project outputs prior to the actual presentation and the actual stuff other projects. So, that was really on me, some scheduling thing that I think now that I know that I can make adjustments in future courses. Things I shouldn't have done, I shouldn't have made the project statement due so late in the semester because that also would have benefited for from some revisions. I had that project statement due like the last possible moment in the class, and I think there were things that a lot of students I think would have loved the opportunity to revise, but it was due like the day before grades were due, so there wasn't really a lot of time and energy for continuing that feedback at that late of the semester. So that's a couple of those things, but I also wanted to share, and I can send these out to anyone who might want these resources, but here's just a few resources. I'm certainly not the first person, won't be the last person. Jessamyn's not the first person nor the last person to use an Unessay in their courses, but there are a lot of really good resources out there, and so I encourage you to take a look at any point. And that is all I have for today. But Ramin, do you have any questions?
No, I think I certainly like the opportunity for students to think out of the box and come up with a different way of communicating an important topic, as I think you talked about the graduate student who had baked that bread, and I'm glad you didn't necessarily share what the person had put in there, but I certainly understood that now you're involving other senses of the individuals in the room, and they're going to get it differently than if you just talked about it. So I appreciate that a lot. I found, especially with freshmen, because in the signature course that I taught this past fall, they need some set of rubrics, and it sounds like you do a better job of giving that sort of things to them than I did in the fall. So I think I want to spend some time thinking about those rubrics so that they have it as they prepare to present their projects. And because some of them did a great job, some of them not so great, but I think some of that is on me, because I think they need some directions on exactly what they should be covering. So that I'm going to be thinking about that for next time.
Yeah. Another thing I've been thinking about is those, not just in this kind of assignment, but other assignments. But I do provide exemplars of all of the work that students are expected to do in the class. And I think it would be a really good exercise to then take the rubrics and have them grade the exemplars that I provide, so that they can kind of see where they think the strengths are in different examples, or how it might look on a rubric. I think I've had semesters where I include rubrics and things in the course, and I point them to them, but then we don't actually engage with the rubrics much in the class. I just say that they're there, and that I'm going to be using those rubrics, but we don't actually spend much time in class engaging with them. And I think that we've sort of talked about in other sessions that if you really want students to use things, or to find value in some of the things that we're doing, that we should really allocate some class time to it. And so I've been really thinking about how to use my class time to communicate the importance of those tools to students.
Yeah, I know when John talks about peer review type of assignments and the way they work, you kind of have to have not only examples of exemplar work, but what is a mediocre type of work, or kind of a middle of the road type of work.
Yeah.
And that seems to work sounds like that seems to work well in a peer review situation, because when you ask students to evaluate each other, I mean, more often than not, what are they going by? I mean, what are they looking for? So I guess I'm going to be spending some time thinking about that, because one of the things I did this past fall, and I've done it in upper division courses too, is to have the students evaluate each other's presentations. But I think you got to give them some way of learning how to do that. Otherwise, what are they going to say? I think it was good. I mean, that's pretty much what kind of feedback you're going to get out of them. They're not going to try and comb through, elements. Some will. Let me get back to that point, from that point, because I think some will, but many don't, or don't know how. So I guess at least with the lower division courses, I'm going to try my best to add more elements to, when I ask you to review somebody else's presentation, what should you be looking for, and how do you give back constructive criticism where they could actually make some improvements in what they did.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, you guys, the network is back on, by the way. So of course, every time you talk, the network somehow in the middle comes back. So
Oh, that is good to know. Well, thank you for sharing that.
and they did send an email out. I don't know if that went to everybody
Yeah.
yet or not.
Yeah, I did.
But I did just get it. So explaining the attacks and so on. Apparently it's been going on since Monday, but I really only noticed it really yesterday. I don't know about you guys, but
It affected us Monday. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, Monday was like right at the beginning of the day.
2 hours before, while I was setting up and
Yeah.
hoping we could get things running. Yes.
Yeah. So,
okay. Yeah, I guess I do remember that, but it didn't feel like as disruptive as it has been the last 2 days, but maybe that's why I
Yeah.
didn't remember.
We got access back about 8:58 on Monday.
Okay. Got it.
Just in time